Thank you. The story I'm going to read is the title story from my collection. It is called A Floating World. She had never danced. Of course not, she said. She'd been born without feet. He took a sip of his white wine. She recognized the look, a slight affront, perhaps, at her bluntness. It was just another fact. She had red hair, she sunburned easily, and her legs, fully formed above the knee, tapered below it to stumps that would never bear her weight. He joked that it was a good thing he wasn't a foot fetishist, and held his breath until her lips curved into a smile. She said she loved that he didn't treat her like she was made of glass. Glass is too transparent, he said, and she was not a woman he could ever look through. She worked with jellyfish. Special fins had been made for her legs that allowed her to skim through the ocean like a seal. Whenever she put them on, she imagined herself as the two-tailed Orisha she had once seen stamped into a silver medallion in a Jamaican shop. As she spooled angel hair onto her fork, she described the weightless lives of these creatures, an alien existence, drifting in the warm currents, silently waiting for prey to be swept into their trailing tentacles, something we land dwellers likely couldn't comprehend. After dinner, they returned to her house and had sex. As he touched her legs, the hands she found not quite as steady as she'd expected a surgeon's to be. She realized he was feeling under the skin, sensing the bone structure, the musculature, such as it was, over the slender pegs that she'd inherited in lieu of feet. He pressed, leaving a thumbprint where her ankle might have been. Men had avoided touching her there, fearful, perhaps, of causing pain or crushing a delicate bone, even though she told them how strong her legs could be in the water, as each steady kick propelled her forward. The surgeon didn't need her reassurances. She thought it was as if he knew already that despite her body, she was strong and complete. And later she would say it was that fearless touch that had made her fall in love with him. We can guess at the rest. Keys exchanged, drawers in a bedroom given over to the lover's socks and underwear, a small collection of personal items left behind, a bill, a pair of running shoes, a sky-colored button-down shirt, accumulating a shared history. He learned to navigate the kitchen that had been purpose-built to be accessible to her wheelchair. He took her to charity balls where she joked to anyone who'd asked that a shark had bitten her feet off. On one of these nights, drunk on champagne that someone else's compassion had paid for, he said that they might as well get married in the offhanded voice she'd come to recognize as his way of shielding himself. She turned away from the beads of rain shimmering on the car window and said she couldn't see a good reason why not. He broke into laughter as the rain pelted out a rhythm on the windshield. In her lab, she observed the jellyfish in their tanks trailing in a tattered gown of stinging tentacles through the water. Her hands grasped the wheels of her chair and she rolled to another specimen. A tiny fish floated upside down in a tangle of tentacles. Passivity is no guarantee of harmlessness. A grad student asked what she meant. She shrugged him away. With a net, she lifted a jellyfish from the tank. In the air, its body collapsed into a translucent mass. The surgeon wanted to have a seaside wedding. To her, the ceremony was beside the point. She imagined he wanted the setting to be some concession to her, a reminder of the ocean in which her body felt at its most powerful. She had already proven to him in the pool at his gym how with her fins she was faster and more graceful in the water than any other swimmer. Her jellyfish brought her back the clumsiness of life on land. The grad student hunched over his notes, tapping his pencil against his teeth, while the dead fish made its slow, inevitable way toward the mouth of the jellyfish to be digested. It was at another charity ball that the surgeon told her of his plans. An artist had been hired to create an installation depicting domestic violence. The result was a room carpeted with shards of broken mirror in which some android-like female figures posed, headless, menaced from above by black words cut from acrylic and hung on steel cables. Much was made of the very important work of this very important artist, but she found herself with little patience for this type of talk, and imagined herself peacefully underwater, moving through that muffled space like a seal. The surgeon interrupted her reverie to steal away a moment with her on the balcony. There, he announced the very special gift he was planning to give her. She did not understand at first. A pair of beaded silk pumps. Was this a joke? No, he said, a promise. The transplants would come from a donor but he would make every effort to find someone of similar build so that they would look natural. The work he'd been doing with nerve connections had been very promising. He couldn't yet say if she would have full sensation, but he was sure that with time and therapy, she could have a full range of motion. She shook her head. He meant walking? Yes, he said, and more. Walking, running, dancing, freedom. And what about the pain? She knew he would never intentionally hurt her, didn't she? He wouldn't tell her it was going to be easy, but wasn't she willing to take the risk if it meant a new life? She thought for a few days. Laps in the pool, the water shimmering and breaking ahead of her as she came up to breathe and plunged down again. She swam to the looping doubts in her mind. She'd never considered anything like what the surgeon was now offering her. Life was as it always had been for her. Wishing for another way was fruitless. Still, her imagination went back and forth, as if two selves beckoned to her from the future. One standing proud in the shoes he had given her, a glance over the shoulder across a room filled with revelers, a wave of red hair, a dare, and a slick of crimson lipstick. Another floated solipsistic and complete in the deep blue, her legs more like the tail of a whale than the pale, knobby limbs she witnessed when she opened her eyes under the water. She sat at the bottom of the pool and waited, eyes closed, as though listening for something only she could hear. She returned home from the gym that night and told him of her decision. He held her hands and whispered his excitement. They would dance at their wedding. She looked down at her legs and tried to imagine whether there would be a seam where the new feet were stitched on. His hands over hers were warm and solid. She knew he would do his best. After the operation, everything from her hips down ached. The surgeon was at her bedside, explaining that the bruising and swelling would subside. The feet seemed the color and texture of frozen fish. He said it would take some time for the new blood supply to bring color back to the skin, but that so far her progress was excellent, and the surgical team expected her to make a full recovery. All these medical cliches struck her as meaningless as she looked down upon the alien parts that had been grafted onto her body. Her own skin was puffy and violet blue, where it met the skin of the feet. She dreamed that she would enter the ocean only to find the feet had been carved from stone, and they would drag her straight to the bottom. In time, the swelling did subside, as the surgeon had promised. Each night he tended to her new appendages, with the attention of a priest performing a holy rite. Once the stitches were removed, he carefully applied ointment to the seam, so that scarring would be minimal. Therapy was frustrating. Her body had been unaccustomed to the jerking motions of walking. Where her new foot touched the ground, the fire of 1,000 needles shot up her legs. The weight of her body poised above her feet seemed unbearable. At the end of each session, her joints thrummed with pain. The legs that cut so cleanly through the water were limp joints of meat on land, flopping out from under her at surprising times. She survived by closing her eyes and imagining herself a Medusa in the floating world, careless and nearly bodiless on the warm current. She learned to take her mind off the pain, but the pain never truly allowed her to leave it behind. It held her as tightly as a net. With the surgeon's help, she acclimatized herself to her new parts: shoes, the clipping of toenails, stepping on wet tiles, hot beach sand underfoot. Throughout, the pain pricked at her again and again. The surgeon took her to the best specialists, but they could provide her with no relief. She found herself retreating to what she had begun to think of as her blue world more often to escape. Often the disconnect was so complete that she would come to awareness as though waking from an enchanting dream, to find the surgeon had been awaiting a word from her. As their wedding date approached, she used the stress of planning as an excuse to slip away into her world. The day arrived at last. She wore the shoes he had given her a year earlier. He wanted her to know that he had fulfilled his promise. She found walking in them tricky, even though she had practiced many times before this. The balancing act required to stay upright made her knees ache. Pain licked at her feet like fire. She thought back to the night when he had given her the shoes, the artist in his room of glass shards. She felt she was trapped in that room as she stepped toward the door. Her days of circuits in the pool seemed to her an endless loop that some part of her was now still swimming, like the shark that must swim or die. Those were the last days of her old life. Needles puncturing the feet that were still someone else's feet, though nourished by her own blood, nerves screaming into her own nerves. She would be married to the surgeon. He wanted her to dance with him. He stood awaiting her in the reverent silence she knew well from his somber attentions to her healing scars. Planks of wood had been put down over the sand to help steady her feet. The green, salty tang of the ocean rushed into her lungs with each breath. She concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other without crying out, as the needles dug further into the tender core of her feet. The roar of the waves seemed louder now to her than the music they had chosen together for her walk. It pounded in her ears like her own blood, like the crackling electrical impulses singing pain through her nerves. She closed her eyes for a momentary glimpse of the deep blue. The last thing she felt was the bouquet slipping from her fingers. She was aware of voices around her. She moved as if caught in a powerful current, as if being drawn into a riptide. The surgeon called her name, and she nearly turned back, but she felt now the pull of the ocean drawing her near. She couldn't feel the feet anymore, but a lingering pressure told her she must be walking across the sand into the water. The surgeon screamed her name in panic. She'd never heard that before, and she froze, her muscles clenching in a moment of sympathy for all that was expressed in those syllables. The waves were at her neck now, and she felt as though she was dissolving into them. A thread that was keeping her tethered to the shore tugged at her mind, but she could barely remember what it was. A touch? It was soon lost in the blue, and she felt herself floating toward the silent bottom of the sea, weightless and without boundary, as if her body had been a heavy dress, as if she had gladly unzipped it and wriggled her way out.